So in this video we'll be going through all the different types of ways that you can solve a quadratic equation, and we'll also be going through little clues that you can use to spot how a question is wanting you to solve a quadratic equation. Now before we get started on the methods of solving a quadratic, let's just have a quick refresh on what is a quadratic equation. Now you may already know this, but there's no harm in actually recognizing this, because what you don't want to do is make a question more difficult than what it actually is. Now, a quadratic equation is where you have one letter being used and the highest power of that letter is going to be a 2. So for example, in these examples you can see on your screen, so this first one here, I'm using x and I've got no other letter, and the highest power of x is x squared. In the next one I've got t, and again I've got no other letters and the highest power of t is 2. In this third example I've got p, and again the highest power is squared, and likewise for this the fourth one, again although I've got no single letter, we can still class this as a quadratic because you have got an x squared in there. And finally we've got r. In our second one we've got one letter being used and the highest power is a square. Now in terms of these other examples, so these are examples which aren't quadratic. So this equation here is not quadratic because although we've got only one letter being used, the highest power is 3. So it's this point, it's this term here that makes it not quadratic. And then for the second one with this, you can see that we've got two different letters. So although the highest power is 2, we have got two letters being used, so therefore that is not quadratic because you've got two different letters. So it is important that you're able to spot what is a quadratic, because in an exam they won't tell you it's quadratic. It's just something that you're going to need to spot. So again, another quick refresh is when solving any equation, you are finding the value of the letter. So your answer should always look like x equals a number, t equals a number, or h equals a number. So when you're asked to solve an equation, that's exactly what you should have. So for example, you should have like x equals 3, p equals 2.3, h equals -6, etc. Now when you are solving a quadratic equation, I would say 95% of the time you'll always tend to find that you're going to have two possible answers. Now it is possible, depending on what level of quadratics you're working with, for you to only have one or even no solutions, but generally speaking in a GCSE exam you're generally going to be finding two values. But again, little disclaimer, there is some situations where you may only have one or two solutions. So for example, you may have x equals 2 or 4. You might have p equals 3 or -6. You might have h equals -2 or -3.5, let's say, etc. So let's now have a look at the different ways in which you can solve a quadratic equation. Now I will try and do a video, or there will be a video on each of these different methods, and this video is just going through and getting you to spot what method to use when you're in a GCSE exam. Now the first method is by factorising. Now this is probably the most popular method of solving quadratic and can appear on both the calculator and non-calculator paper. Now there'll be no indication about whether you factorise, so yes, if there's no, you could use the other methods I'm going to go through, but I would say if there's no clue, then usually factorising is going to be the key thing. You might find if you're doing the foundation paper that a factorising may be an earlier part of the equation and then you're using that factorising to solve it, but again I'll go through that in another video. The next one is looking at the quadratic formula. Now again, this will generally only appear on the calculator paper, and the clue of you using the quadratic formula, because they'll never tell you to use it, is when you're asked to give your answer to some form of rounding. So if a question says give your answer to 2 decimal places or 3 significant figures, let's say, so either mentions decimal places or sig fig, or SF as it's sometimes known as, then that'd be the biggest clue of using the quadratic formula. So don't even bother trying to factorize it, because it most often won't. Just go straight into using the quadratic formula. Now the third method, again, this really only appears on the high GCSE, and if it does, it'll appear near the latter parts of your exam paper. And again, completing the square is another form of factorising, but it's factorising in a certain format. Typically with normal factorising, you're using double brackets. With completing the square, It's single brackets, and again there is another video which shows you how to factorize and solve using completing the square, but they will mention it in the question. Now if they don't specifically ask or use the word completing the square, they definitely won't use CTS. That's just something I abbreviate it as. Then what they will do is they will ask you in a previous part of the question to factorize in this form, which is basically in the form of completing the square. Now, if you have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about, do not worry. As I said, this is probably a level 8, level 9 topic that you will get taught. And then finally, the last and probably least voluntary method of solving a quadratic is using a graph. Now, again, you can solve a quadratic by plotting the equation on the graph, which will be probably an easier earlier part of the question, and then you're seeing where the parabola, where the U shape or N shape or the curve crosses the x-axis, and those values will be the solutions of the equation. Now, again, a biggest indication of using the graph will be that you will be given graph paper, or you'll be given a set of axes that you'll then need to plot, and then you can then use the graph to solve the equation. So let's now have a look at some examples of what methods you would use to actually solve this. So if you had a question that looks like this, you can see here that there's no mention of rounding, there's no graphs involved, and there's no mention of completing the square or that a plus a squared plus b. So this method is going to be factorising. So we can solve, oh, don't know why I've gone for that pen. Let's get rid of that. So for this, we're going to solve by factorising. And again, I will do a video on how we factorise. So with this question, what we need to do is factorise this first. So I'm looking for two numbers that add together to make 10 and multiply together to give me positive 24. So again, my two numbers are going to be 6 and 4. So they're the numbers that are going to go inside my brackets. And again, the key thing is never forget to write equals 0. That's really, really important. And a lot of examiners now are coming down on students for not writing equals 0. And then from this, I want to make each bracket equal to 0. So I've got x equals minus 6 and x equals minus 4. And there are my two possible answers as we discussed earlier. Now again, I will do a video on how to solve and factorize quadratic equations, and we'll go from there after you've watched that video if this makes absolutely no sense. Now in this particular question here, you can see that it's asked us to solve this quadratic equation, but it's asked us to use some form of rounding. So what this will generally involve is by using the quadratic formula. And again, I will do a video on how we use a quadratic formula to solve a quadratic. Now in this next clip here, we can see that it uses the words completing the square. So that's pretty obvious that I need to use CTS. Now, as mentioned in the description of the methods of solving quadratic, a question might ask you to factorize, and then it might give you it's x squared plus 8x minus 5 in the form of x plus a squared plus b. And then part B of the question might then say to solve x plus a squared, what am I doing that for? Ask you to solve. And then the original question, which was x squared plus 8x minus 5 equals 0, or it might say hence solve. And that then what I'd have to use is use CTS to solve, particularly if it uses the word hence. Oh, don't know why it keeps doing that. Which is where you think if it says hence or otherwise, then and again I could use any method of factorizing, but if it does say hence, it means that I do have to use the method of completing the square to solve the quadratic equation. Again, there is another video that explains how to do that. Now this last one here, you can see we've been given a graph. So again, not quite Pictionary, but you can pretty much guess which method I need to use for this. So here what we need to do is we need to solve graphically. Now in terms of this, what we need to do is complete the table. That'll be the first thing we do. We then need to plot the coordinates. we then need to join the points up. So join the points with a curve. And then in part C, it then says for us to use the graph to estimate the solution to this particular equation. And again, what we're doing is we're going to check where the curve crosses the x-axis. So for example, if I quickly do this, so here we've got, and I just work out the missing values. So I've got 4 minus 6 minus 1 gives me minus 2 minus 3. And then that's going to give me minus 1, and that's going to give me 1, 4, 3. So once I've completed my table, I then need to plot these coordinates. So minus 4, 3 is here. Then 3 minus 1, minus 3 minus 1, which is here. Then it's at minus 3, which is there. Then minus 3 again. Then at minus 1. And then 1 at 3. And then 2 is at 9, which is up here. And then what I then need to do is connect these points up. Now this is going to be a bit of a challenge. I'm just going to stop there. Do a bit of a loop, and then just need to make sure that I'm connecting all the points up, preferably with a smooth curve, which that one's not too bad. And then the solutions will be what these numbers here are. So one solution would be roughly around about minus 3.4, so that's one answer. And this one here is going to be about 0.4, I would say. And there's my two solutions. And that's what you would do to solve graphically. So like I said, in terms of looking at these questions, I will do a video on going through each of these methods, which I strongly recommend that you have a go at. Now, in terms of factorising the quadratic formula, I would say solving by factorising is probably going up to foundation. Quadratic formula, completing the square and using the graph are probably higher. But again, if you are doing foundation, there's no harm in learning this. Definitely in terms of the quadratic formula, I wouldn't bother with CTS because again, that's unlikely you will ever get asked to use that, and it's not on the syllabus.